let's see. Our next speaker is Mike Vasey. Mike, why don't you take over the screen?
Okay, I'll do that. Thank you very much.
And let me introduce you, though, first, Mike, if I
Sure.
can. Mike's going to be talking about the mystery and history of coastal endemics and Manzanitas. Mike's the director of the San Francisco State University's San Francisco Bay Estuarian Research Reserve and associate director for science engagement for the Estuary and Ocean Science Center, and a lecturer at San Francisco State University in the Department of Biology. Mike's an expert in the evolution and taxonomy of Manzanitas, and he has also been working on this for about 25 years. He is the co-author with Tom Parker of the Field Guide to Manzanitas. He's an author for the Jepson Manual and the Flora of North America for Manzanitas. He's a personal friend, and I have to say, Mike's a very funny guy, and he keeps us laughing when we're out there on the mountain with Doug. He's teaching us about Manzanitas. Now, I just want to share with all of the 72 people out there that Doug and I have named a ridge after Doctors Parker and Vasey. One time we were on the mountain there with them, and the two of them saw a manzanita, or what they thought might be a manzanita, straight uphill without any path to it at all. And without any thought, they just charged right on up the ridge. And yes, it really was a manzanita. So we now call this Parker and Vasey Ridge. They found our rare endemic San Bruno manzanita. We actually now have 10 growths of them around in various places. So we have Parker and Vasey Ridge, and now we have Mike Vasey, who's going to talk to us about mystery and history. Mike.
Yes, thank you, David. That's a whole lot of really interesting news to me. And so anyway, I really appreciate being here with you all. And thanks, Tom. That was I had never heard that talk before, believe it or not, even though I've known Tom for a long time. So a great kickoff, I think, to you're going to get utterly saturated with Arctostaphylos today, but so I apologize in advance for that. But it's, again, there's more than enough interesting aspects to it that hopefully it'll be worth your while. So here is, Arctostaphylos imbricata. Tom had a similar shot, I think the same shot, looking out over the city. And the really significant thing about San Bruno Mountain, in a way, as I've been pondering this talk and going over all the places that I've been to, different manzanita stands around the West and down in Guatemala, and et cetera. And there are just a few places that are real hotspots for diversity in Arctostaphylos. And there are two that really rise to the top of the ultra hotspots for manzanita diversity. Probably the top is the Lockheed Chalks down in Santa Cruz County, with 6 species of manzanita, all basically co-occurring, and 2 of which are only found on the Chalks. So that's pretty amazing. But San Bruno Mountain is number 2. It's got 5 species of manzanitas, all within shouting distance, within a mile, say, and 2 of which only occur on San Bruno Mountain. So San Bruno Mountain truly is exceptional in the sense of the local endemism within this group, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. But to put it in a little bit broader context, if you look at this idea of endemism, which is just restricted range, so on the x-axis here, we're looking at ranges of really, just within, this is like San Bruno Mountain to things like Uva ursi over here. But if you look at it, you'll see that basically in the maritime zone, very close to the coast, the vast majority of the local endemics occur along the coast. And so the question then is what's going on? Why do we have so many local endemics along the coast? And most of those endemics occur in a particular kind of a natural community called maritime chaparral. And this was a figure that was created down at Elkhorn Slough, and so it doesn't include all the maritime chaparral, but you can really see that in the Central Coast region, this is kind of the heart of maritime chaparral. And it's also the heart of endemism in terms of local Manzanita species. So Tom came up with this title, The Mystery and the History. So I just decided to run with it. And I'm going to just make the sort of the hypothesis that what's really driving this local endemism in Arctostaphylos are really three major factors that have to do with habitat. And then one factor that is more broad and has to do with the history of the group, which Tom touched upon earlier. But the three factors are basically fire, and these are, they're intentionally Fs so that you can remember it. Fire, fog, fertility, which is really more soil infertility, and then the frequency of environmental change over time. So the three habitat factors really, or ecological factors, are interacting over time, and this is really the big key here. So most of California is adapted to fire. And the Manzanitas, in fact, are not just adapted to fire, but they're basically dependent upon fire, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Fog and the infertility, these drivers basically generate these islands of, the fog is a climatic factor. It keeps kind of moist and cool along the coast. And then there are these outcrops of infertile soils along the coast that tend to be the places where Manzanitas occur, and you certainly see that up on San Bruno Mountain. And then essentially the time factor, these interacting fire, fog, and soil infertility, over time, there's these expansions and contractions so that you kind of have a shifting mosaic over the landscape in which different Manzanitas are moving around over time, coming together. They hybridize, create new combinations, and then climate changes and they move apart again. So it's an ongoing phenomenon that involves change over time, essentially. So just go through these factors really briefly. In the case of fire, Manzanitas, of course, have these two basic life history traits, one being they resprout, but the seeds of the Manzanita are still dependent upon fire typically to germinate. Whereas the really unusual group in this regard, there are quite a few different kinds of plants in California that sprout and that depend on fire, will sprout at least, and are stimulated by fire. But in the case of Manzanitas and Ceanothus, for example, and you have this phenomenon where they're just utterly dependent on seed being stimulated to germinate after fire. So that's the obligate seeder characteristic. The issue with fog is very interesting. That's something that I studied for my dissertation, and found that the fog is really a very, very important factor along the coast of California for a lot of species. Think redwoods. Here you can see the fog goes inland, and especially where you have these little gaps in the coast, like in Monterey or down in San Luis Obispo, and it keeps it cool, it keeps it moist. And you can also see that little blue line here. This is that Johnstone and Dawson paper. So you can really see how there's a dramatic difference in temperature and actual moisture availability along the immediate coast. But it's not the full story, because in fact, you also have the fog itself is kind of kept down by a temperature inversion layer. So it's really foggy about, like 400 feet above sea level. And then you get higher than that and you start getting, it gets more warm and dry. But what keeps it similar to the fog, the lowland fog areas, is that on the uplands you get a lot more rain actually than the interior or the lower part of the system. So the rain in the winter, the excessive rain in the winter, cool temperatures, it all combines so that the coast from sea level up to the coastal facing ridges that may be higher in elevation still have a large proportion of these endemics. And so, like, here's that place I was just telling you about at the Chalks, where we have 6 species that co-occur. And Tom gave a nice introduction to the idea that you really have these two there was a, a deep lineage divide, and we have the little clade represented, and these guys grow right next to a representative. This is a glutinosa, which is only found on in the chalks, and these two together really are fairly, rather than hybridizing, they actually have some decent barriers to hybridization. Hard to find any individuals that have any hybrids at all. So you can have this combination of little clade growing with big clade without a lot of hybridization. And another mix in here is the tetraploids, but I'm not going to get into that right now. I'm just going to stick with the little clade and big clade for the moment. But the point here is that it's a highly infertile soils that kind of are like islands in a sea of otherwise a forested landscape. And if you just take that to an extreme, here's another just indication where we have, again, we have the big clade in bright yellow, the little clade in red, and then we have these situations that Tom was referring to where you might have a hybridization event between the big and the little clade, two different species, resulting in a somewhat infertile entity, which then doubles its chromosomes and becomes a tetraploid. And oftentimes we find members of the big clade, little clade, and tetraploid all growing in these very challenging habitats with different kinds of infertile soils. So here you have, for example, Hookerai pajaroensis and crustacea in the Pajaro Hills. When you come down here, it's much more of a sandstone. And we have, or sandy, actually, habitats out here. You have, and then, the upshot is that here we got like about 9 different species, and 5 of which are highly local endemics. So again, it's that combination of fire and these infertile soils and these foggy environments that really create this opportunity for all these endemics to co-occur. So the history factor, Tom again was talking a little bit about this. We had historically, back in the Miocene, during a sort of a climate optimum, a period of time, a couple of million years, where it was much warmer than usual in this region of this very high, 3,000 meters high, in other words, about 9,000 feet high, big plateau area called the Nevada Plano. And this has just recently become part of the literature and understood to have been a major factor in vegetation and probably some of the fossil floras that we have from that time. But eventually what happened is we had the breakup of the Nevada Plano into the Basin and Range Province area, which got very hot and dry. You had uplift, and you had all these species that normally were occurring back in this region, like, for example, Catalina ironwood fossils are found in this region. Anyway, they all got pushed towards the coast and ended up here along the coast. So what we have along the coast here is this mix of a lot of species that were probably fairly ancient, mixing it up with species that are now very recent. So essentially, this gets to the issue of endemism. And person that I had the pleasure of getting to know very well back in the old days, I took this picture in like probably 1970s or 70s probably. Anyway, this is Ledyard Stebbins, and he was came up with this concept of the paleo-endemics and neo-endemics. Paleo meaning these are probably very old relictual species that their ranges have contracted so that they're now just barely hanging on in certain kinds of places. And then the neo-endemics, which are typically newly arisen species that have not had a chance to expand in range. So basically, you have this mix of different kinds of endemics. They're not all endemics are alike. And a good example, Tom mentioned Arctostaphylos rudis. Here it is. It's a burrow former. It has shreddy bark. It's really a bizarre species occurring on the dune habitats or sandy habitats of the Burton Mesa. And it's in the little clade. And then you have another species that's co-occurring with Arctostaphylos rudis in the big clade. And this is clearly a part of this group with very similar to imbricata, with heart-shaped leaves, and basically an obligate seeder rather than a sprouter. And in any case, so you have this combination, just like I showed you in the figure illustrated in Monterey, where you have the old clade, new clade, and endemics. Probably one is a paleo-endemic, one's a neo-endemic. Have a similar. This is here's an example of two of these one neo-endemic, one paleo-endemic. The neo-endemic is a species that Parker and I kind of co-discovered at the same time in different places in the Gabilan range, but it's a really unique species. It clearly has fruit very similar to Arctostaphylos glauca, an interior species, and a leaf form that's very similar to this coastal heart-shaped leafy bracted species, of which the species down there at Burton Mesa is reminiscent, and many others, including Imbricata. And then over here we have this species that it was really mysterious. It looks a bit like Arctostaphylos manzanita, but it had characteristics that were not like manzanita, but it actually took learning the ploidy level, which is diploid. Arctostaphylos manzanita is tetraploid, and the molecular genetic data put this species clearly in the little clade, which is again unlike some of these others. So here is a paleo-endemic, and Tom and I, just by total chance, really, and we've only discovered two new species, unlike all those botanists in the beginning who were naming species right and left, like for example, Alice Eastwood. In any case, it just was a pure coincidence that we discovered these two, and they both are really good examples of this idea of a paleo-endemic and a neo-endemic. And then there's Arctostaphylos pacifica. Is it a neo-endemic? Is it a paleo-endemic? What is it really? We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but pacifica, I will say, is a mystery. And it really invites, and in fact, I think when I talk a little bit more about this later this afternoon, it's a species that, or whatever, that really needs further work. I'll just suffice to say that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And with that, I'm going to end. I'm just going to say, as Tom's talk really illustrated beautifully, I think that there are new insights and technologies that are happening now, will happen in the future. We're getting really this great array of new tools to be able to sort of tease apart this whole issue of the origins of these different species, these different kinds of endemics. So it's an exciting time, and San Bruno Mountain, I will say, and we'll get to it a little bit further later, is in a very exciting place to utilize these tools to try to generate these understandings. So thankfully it still exists. The habitats are still there, the species are still there, and thank you, Doug, and everybody, and Doug and David, for putting this conference together. It's a lot of fun, and thank you very much. And that's it for me.